let's attack. Forward.
The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate it. I used to teach college courses, not usually in history, but in other subjects. And I got into the habit of having a hat for each one of my classes, because the students seemed to remember the hat even if they didn't remember the subject. So I'm told I need more volume, so I will try and do that. This is my hat for today, and hopefully if none of the other stuff works, the hat might make an impression. Easton, as most of you know, was well known as a wide open town, especially for speakeasies and for brothels, for prostitutes. And actually we need to talk about Easton and the surrounding area. So we will try and do that, but I don't want to get too far afield because the subject can get endless if you do that. But at least one newspaper account said there were some 64 brothels in Easton and the Easton area, which gives you an idea of the size. Typical size of these brothels, I mean, some of them were small, some of them were very large. Supposedly a typical size would be 10 girls. And there might be as many as 40 customers there at a time. And the girls, of course, would go through as many customers as they could over the course of the night, and the 40 would cycle. Now, one police report said that there were huge roadhouses up on Bushkill Drive, up on by the river, by the Delaware, and some of them were fairly massive in the amount of traffic that they could take. One police report insisted that some 1,500 customers would go through those in a weekend. So you're talking a lot of traffic. New York City was the source of a lot of it. Some of it came from Philadelphia. They used to have barkers that would go around Madison Square Garden in the fights on Friday night and would advertise buses to Easton, rides to Easton, and folks could go to the fights in New York and then go out to Easton for the rest of the weekend and be ready, I suppose, for work on Monday morning, although God help the customers, right? So it was quite an enterprise. Now, I want to drop back just for a few minutes and put Easton and the wide open Easton in the setting of why Easton. Why was it here? And the plain fact is that Easton had been doing some of this really since very early in its existence. We all know it started out as the frontier village, right? Chidsey's book. And was there for the Indian treaties, where there were lots of transients coming into town. And from then the Revolution and the soldiers, soldiers, and from that grew the transient business, the transport business for the grain market for Philadelphia, the passage down the Delaware and down the canal system, where Easton was the hinge. A lot of things were traded through Easton, and then finally they started picking off some of this grain and made mills. Easton became a manufacturing center. Then as the Industrial Revolution took hold, of course, the iron was coming down this way. There was a huge industrial complex in Abbott Street, which is off the Lehigh River on the south side of the river. There are just ruins there now. But all of this meant that there were massive numbers of transients going through Easton. So Easton grew an enormous hotel and tavern business with all of the accompaniments that you would expect for that sort of a trade. If you think about it, where would a good good businessman go, he's not going to find the kind of entertainment that he necessarily wants in Moravian Bethlehem or Moravian Nazareth. It just ain't going to happen. Sorry, folks. Except, of course, it started to, especially on the what do they call it? The south side of Bethlehem, the stuff over by the hospital. Easton had a long history. In 1816, we have a recording in a diary by a young lady who said that Easton was popularly known locally as Sodom. Now we have to take that with a little grain of salt, because the young lady was the daughter of a Presbyterian minister, and so what might seem like Sodom to her might not be so bad to us. But still in all, the statement was made, and it sets the stage, I think, for what went on. Easton developed 3 breweries, beer breweries, from good German immigrants. The first starting in 1821, so very early. That was the Seitz Brewery, which many of you, if you know Easton history, of course, will recognize that name. Now, there were interesting innovations that happened. In the 1870s, bottling came in. And, of course, in the time-honored fashion, competitors tried to hobble the bottling industry and destroy its competitive effectiveness by legislation. We'll get the health inspectors in. So they had curious legislation which required that bottling not be located in the same place as the brewery. Why? Well, they said it was for health reasons. We suspect there might be something else going on. So the Seitz people they obeyed the law, and they put their bottling plant on down by the river, and they put their brewery down by the Lehigh River, as they always had. And this would, of course, mean a good amount of trucking between the two, so to cut down on the traffic, they ran a pipe underneath 2nd Street to connect up the brewery with the bottling plant. It all made good sense, was legal. They were allowed to do this starting in really the 1890s. With the Prohibition looming, in 2 of the breweries of the original families bailed out. The Seitz family sold out in the early 20th century. The Kuglers, which actually was the largest brewery in Easton, still was family owned even into the Prohibition era, but the Filer Brewery sold out and became known as the Bushkill Brewery to corporate interests. So there were folks who weren't, didn't have their name on the door and had other interests, especially staying in business and making money. Now, what do you do if you're a brewer and national prohibition comes into effect? You have a problem. You need to change your product line. And many of them, all 3 of them actually, brewed what they called cereal beverage. We have advertisements in the paper for Seitz CB, God help us, and they insist, try it, you'll like it. It sounds ghastly to me. I confess that I've never encountered it and never drunk it, so maybe it's wonderful, but it doesn't sound very appetizing, and apparently the public didn't either. They brewed soda water, they did all kinds of legal things, but as you would expect in the Prohibition era, late at night, they were back to brewing beer and distributing it in the old fashion. For the Seitz Brewery, they had a unique opportunity because of their expertise that they had developed historically. And that was to run a pipe, like they'd run under 2nd Street, but they ran it under the Delaware River into New Jersey. Now, we do know that this actually took place because one gentleman, when he was a teenager, actually went down, dived, and found the pipe, which he reported back was more of a rubber tube, a large rubber tube way through there, which makes a certain amount of sense. Why New Jersey? Does anybody know? The laws were different. Exactly right. New Jersey never ratified Prohibition. They were subject to federal prohibition anyway because a sufficient number of states had ratified the constitutional amendment, so they had to go along with it. But New Jersey never voted for it. And their governor, Edward Edwards, billed himself as a wet. And he did something that was the forerunner of some of what's been going on lately. He had no state laws against alcohol, no New Jersey state prohibition, and he prohibited his enforcement officers from helping the feds enforce the federal law. So with, I think there were like 16 federal officers assigned to the entire state of New Jersey. That was it. That's all they had. So they did the best they could, but it wasn't very good. And the net result was New Jersey was an easier place to sell beverages. So the pipe came up in Phillipsburg, actually a little bit north of Phillipsburg. They put the stuff in kegs and trucked it out to the waiting markets, the speakeasies, wherever. They also had a lively trucking out of the plant, by then the one along the Delaware River, here in Easton, because there were many speakeasies that were operating pretty much openly in Easton and in the surrounding territories. Now, they couldn't do that openly during the day, so they had an entrance which was boarded up. But at night, all the boards would come down and the trucks would go out, and then they boarded up again and basically told the enforcement officials that, heaven forfend, they weren't doing anything. So it gives you an idea of the sort of things that were going on. We'll come back to the Sites Brewery in a minute or two. Let's talk a little bit about the advent of Prohibition itself. We know, most people I think know, it was passed as an amendment to the Constitution, and then there was federal enforcement legislation, the Volstead Act, which implemented it. But Prohibition had partially come before that. President Wilson was supported heavily in office by the temperance movement, and so he had used the excuse of World War I to institute prohibition wherever he could. So, for example, he had a federal regulation which prohibited the sale of alcoholic beverages within 15 miles of a military training camp. And since every college and university had a training camp, initially they were enforcing it everywhere, including Easton. The Easton people went to court and got a ruling from court that the minor training camp at Lafayette College just wasn't enough of an excuse to warrant this, to black out the entire city of Easton because of a couple of trainees up in Lafayette. And so it was quashed for Easton, but lots of other places became subject to it. Wilson, as the war ended, the rationale for the whole thing, to keep the boys that were away from home, to keep them clean, Wilson vowed that he would keep all of these regulations in place until the last soldier was demobilized. And so he really was doing his level best to keep the United States as dry as possible until the constitutional amendment could be passed. So people were aware of it and somewhat prepared for what was going to happen when Prohibition actually came in January of 1920. The newspaper, interestingly, reported that Easton was dry as the Sahara on New Year's Day for 1920. I, of course, would never doubt what a reporter would say, heaven forfend. But certainly there were editorials later on in the year that decried the openness of Easton to alcoholic beverages, especially the speakeasy trade. Basically all of the hotels and all of the large restaurants that had been selling alcohol before continued doing it. The editorial said there would be a reckoning, but no reckoning came. And we continued on through that for quite a while, actually, with very little enforcement or token enforcement. Meanwhile, it's a little more difficult to document the brothel business and the betting business, but we do have pieces that do appear. We know that Pine Street was in operation long before Prohibition arrived. The famed Pine Street brothels actually dated back probably to the mid-1800s at least. And there are lots of editorials and reports of police raids that had happened. Just before Prohibition, a construction company operator named David Nevin had become mayor of Easton. He was supported by clean up the town groups and actually ran on a clean up Easton slogan. However, he in the start, it was several years before he did anything after he was elected. Then finally he did put a campaign to close down the brothels. It was discovered that the police had compiled a list of all the brothels in Easton. They had 27 of them on the list, and had, in the time-honored fashion, delivered that list to the mayor's office and then done nothing, because that's what they had been instructed to do. Well, of course, the mayor, who had been elected by all of these clean up the town folks, was publicly shocked and horrified that this should have happened, let the lead policeman, the police detective, retire, got rid of him, and announced that there would be a crackdown on all of these brothels to start next Wednesday. Guess what happened when they tried to enforce the law next Wednesday? Brothels. He did it again 2 years later, same thing. He announced that there would be a crackdown, but again he didn't want to get the poor girls who worked in the brothels unnecessarily in trouble. So he announced that the crackdown would start next Monday. Same result. A canny politician. To give an idea of what sort of business this was at the time, it was very entrepreneurial. There were some 2,000 brewers in the United States at the turn of the century. Lots of them were little. They were what we would consider craft brewers today. It's, of course, a little harder to document the brothel trade, but I think an example of what was going on is the kind of lead criminal story in 1921, which was a hijacking and murder by the Tony Turco gang. They hijacked a load of silk. And many of you may know that, of course, the Simone silk plants, and there were others. It was a very valuable commodity. They got several $1,000s worth off of a truck in New Jersey, in Cat's Swamp, which is just over really on the other side of the Jersey line. A motorcyclist happened by during the hijacking, and Tony got the wind up. He thought it might be a motorcycle cop. It wasn't. It was just some guy on a motorcycle. So Tony blew the guy away and threw him in a ditch. There was a public outcry when the body was found, Lots of research into it, and the police in Easton were dispatched to pick up the Tony Turco gang, which they did. Now, who were these folks? It was no organized mob. There was no Cosa Nostra. There was a Black Hand Society, which really operated to prevent competition in the same way that it had been done in time-honored fashion back in Sicily. This was done in the South Side in the Italian community. A couple of years earlier, one butcher had exceeded his limits. He didn't have the imprimatur of the Black Hand, but opened his butcher shop anyway. So the Black Hand Society decided he had to be killed, and there were no hitmen at that time. They just got all the members of the society together and had them draw lots, and the guy that drew the red one had to do the killing. Well, the gentleman that drew the lot wasn't, he hired a hit